Hello and welcome to this Hangout on Air. My name is Owen Corso and this is Jake Chalkley. We are creative specialists here at Google. You may have seen us a couple of times before doing these Hangout on Airs for HTML5 immersions, helping agencies, clients make the transition to HTML5. So myself, I come from a computer science background. I've worked at advertising agencies on global brands for the last 10 years. And Jake?
And my background's actually a little bit different. I come from a graphic design background, and I picked up HTML, CSS, and JavaScript coding along the way. We're going to run through a demo in just a couple moments, but I think why this Hangout on Air is important is my background was in jQuery before joining the team here, and having that switch to JavaScript and learning to use the enabler, we're going to go over some of those gotchas that I went through and some of those just learning hurdles. It may look like a lot, but at the end of the day, we're going to have a fully working, expandable ad that's ready for mobile. So if you haven't downloaded those source files, go ahead and download those now. But Owen, do you want to show them what they're going to see today?
Sure. So we're gonna build an in-app creative. I'm going to just share my screen here, and so starting from Studio, we have. Starting from Studio, we've uploaded our creative files on step 2, and now we're at step 4, the preview tab of DoubleClick Studio. We have in here a preview of the ad inside of our creative preview, and some exciting news that happened recently is that we got the Creative Preview app in the App Store. So now it's available for both Android and iOS devices. So when I'm previewing this creative in Studio, I can push directly to my phone. So here it says we pushed it to a mobile device, and if I go back to showing you my screen, so here I just got a notification right here at the top. And I'm just going to open this up, and it opens directly to the screen where I can open the ad, and then now there it is, the same ad you were just seeing on my screen with full functionality on the device and showing me how it's going to look and respond in a mobile on-the-device environment. And this is that's the workflow. It's one click to publish to my phone, and it gets a push notification. So that's pretty powerful. That's a pretty good workflow when you're trying to develop on mobile devices. So now let's go through and actually, Jake, do you want to actually build it? Do you want to walk through and look at some of the nuts and bolts?
I don't know what else we're going to do for 54 minutes, so here we are.
Okay.
So we're going to switch over to my screen there. And just so you guys know, keep asking those questions. We see them popping up. We're going to take some time for Q&A at the end, but it's good to keep asking questions because I could see a couple in there already about Google fonts and font sizes and polite load, and we're definitely going to go through some of that stuff today. So hopefully by now you guys can see that deck all set up. It looks like you can. And like Owen mentioned, what's our motivation for doing this today? Well, you could use tools like GWD, you could use the studio layouts, but there's always a benefit in knowing what's going on behind the scenes, what's actually happening. And that really helps for when you need to debug things and, kind of just get into the nuts and bolts of customization. So obviously, the usuals we're going to run through today is HTML, JavaScript, including the enabler and including polite load and load size. We're also going to get into Google Fonts. We'll talk about animations and the different tactics for animations that are out there, as well as some CSS, the skin of the creative, what makes the creative give that look and feel. So as Owen mentioned, we have the Creative Preview app, which not only works on Android, but we just released the iOS one. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, we have both platforms to test on, which is fantastic. And it just gives, we're here trying to make these great tools, great products and you guys as advertisers and creative agencies can use any of these products to the degree that's useful for you. And Creative Preview is an example of that, where it's giving you a way to see your in-app creatives. Previously, it was kind of tricky to kind of see for exactly what it is, what you're building on the device.
Yeah, I think nothing beats looking at your ad on the native device. There's going to be a lot of emulators out there, and I'm not saying don't use emulators, because that will get you 80% there. But I mean, if you're truly testing your device, now you have an easier solution to do so.
Yeah, a lot of companies find it useful to get a device library. Then you have this ability to test across these devices. When you think about a mobile-first mindset, when you incorporate mobile into as a primary core constituent of a creative digital marketing strategy.
So let's go back to the slides here, and we'll continue on with the presentation. So if you want to see that preview that we were just showing up on your own phone, you can go ahead and scan the QR code, or you can go ahead and enter in this Google URL here. I'll give you just a couple seconds to get that going. And again, if you haven't downloaded the source files yet, go ahead and download those if you want to follow along with us. So today you might feel a little bit overwhelmed. We're going to be going through a lot of content. Some of the words might sound like jargon if you're new to this, but if you have a basic web design background, you should be able to follow along nicely. And at the end of this, you're going to be feeling like a gymnast in an overcompressed GIF in our presentation. A couple things to get out of the way first, though. Our target browsers for rich media, this is pretty much the standards that everybody's going by nowadays. I mean, there's an error in this slide that obviously should say Internet Explorer 10 plus. For the most part, I believe we're on Firefox like 20 plus, Chrome 20 plus now, so those are dating back really far. But I think IE9 is probably the one that I usually have to come up with the most fallbacks for. But since IE10 is the latest version we support, we should be good there. And as always, a lot of this content that we're walking through can also be viewed in the Rich Media Help Center. It's a fantastic resource for getting up to speed on HTML5. So HTML5, the structure. Owen, would you like to talk to us a little bit? I feel like I'm talking all.
Right. So we have these three kind of primary constituents of HTML5. What is HTML5? It's basically three things. We have the HTML, which is the structure, and that's the markup is basically text, and it's set up like a tree, and that's basically like the skeleton, so the bones and the it just kind of builds out your structure.
And in this slide, we'll have the slides available for download after this, hang out on air. But there's a great Samsung Galaxy example that shows the bare bones of our HTML5 expandable ad that we're building, but it also has some cool functionality that you can't really get in the template using some screen grabs, and it's just a really nice example of an ad. So be sure to check that out after the presentation.
And then we have the scripts and the style sheets. We kind of put those in the head tag, and this kind of gives the presentation and the behavior. So your scripts is your behavior. It's kind of like the brains of the operation, and then the style sheets is kind of like the clothing. Well, how you're gonna stylize the structure that you have, and give it different colors, different borders, different size fonts, different display behavior where it's going to either float to the left, float to the right, and you have the ability to kind of decouple all of these three different types of tasks, like building the structure, building in the behavior, and stylizing. You keep all those separate with these three kind of concepts.
As well as you might notice that we're going to be talking about the Web Font Loader library. This is a a JavaScript library. It's open source that we're going to go into in a little bit. That you can load in Google web fonts with it. You can pull in Typekit fonts as well as upload your own font. So pretty standard stuff here. Again, if you're not very new to web development, if you've made some web pages in your time, this is pretty standard stuff. Then we're going to get into the basic DOM structure as you see here. So going a little bit line by line, and sorry for cutting you off, Owen, if you want to talk about it.
Well, so what you might be asking, what is DOM? So DOM stands for Document Object Model, and when the web browser reads in this HTML page, which is just text, it then goes line by line like Jake's about to do, and it assembles this representation in code with, what's the body tag, what are the children of the body tag, oh, that div tag with an ID called collapse. Well, let's create a new entity in memory for this. It has a bunch of attributes and methods you can call on a div, and you can refer to it by its ID and all things like that. So the DOM, as you start to work with HTML and construct your own kind of ads, you get very friendly with the DOM and its properties, methods, and then it's of its children and its children's children, and how to traverse the tree with siblings and whatnot.
And so in all this, we have our ad commented out, but if you kind of just take a look from the forest view instead of the trees view, you can see that we're going to have our collapse panel. We're going to have our expanded panel in here as well, and then we're also going to be bringing in the JavaScript file, which is going to have the main logic of our creative in there. And then within those, within the collapse panel, you're going to have your expand button, so a way to get to that expanded version. In the expanded version, you're going to have our background image. We're going to have a way to collapse the ad again, as well as we're going to have our CTA, also known as the call to action button, and that will click through and drive your leads to your site. So what happens on initial load?
Well, so there's this notion of polite loading, which is essentially the web browser gets a web page that has HTML on it, and then it goes line by line, loads in all of the assets, line by line. And so what you want to do when ads are served on a page, they're served into an iframe, which has its own line by line, kind of like outside the flow of the main page. So a polite load gives the user, just what it needs initially, which is just the text, and then once the browser is done going line by line, you can hook into that event. When it's done going line by line, it calls a page load event, and that you can load in additional assets like images, other JavaScript files, components, and in that way, the user gets your ad. It doesn't have to wait for all these heavy assets as it's going line by line. It loads in after the fact, and that's polite. You're not inundating the user to have to wait and see nothing for such a long time. And it's just a few milliseconds. It depends on your connection speed, but when you're in a mobile environment, you want to show the user something as soon as possible, whether it's a loading screen or some kind of intro animation that's very light, or if it's something you're only going to show in the expanded state, you don't want to force the user to wait until they're done loading all these heavy things that they're going to see in the expanded state, when all they need to see is just a simple collapsed state. Mm-hmm. And the enablers init event is when you're building creatives on the DoubleClick platform. That's the event, not the page load event that you want to wait for.
And so if we go back to the slides here, you can see a little bit of a visual representation of what Owen was just talking about. This is Google Chrome's Inspect Element feature, which if you haven't read up on that, that's essential for your web development needs. And you can see, like in the first couple lines here is just our tag being called, and then we go into the initial load section. Owen mentioned the polite load, and we'll get into that in a second. That would be the calls that are down here on the right side of this blue line.
So yeah, just looking at some of the questions in here. So this is where you would include any other types of assets that you want. For instance, GreenSock's animation library, that's a JavaScript file. You put that, you can load that in after the fact, in enabler init, then make a request to get URL for that animation package. It's just like a JavaScript file. And then once it loads onto the page, it loads into your ad, then you can begin calling using all of that rich animation functionality. And there's another question about whether or not it counts towards your total page, your total file size in DCM and Studio. And there's kind of a misnomer, or the way you think about file size is that Studio is just basically a way to preview your ads. DCM is a way to create a tag. Since everything has been converted to enhanced banners, the file size kind of question and the IAB standards that we're trying to announce for HTML5, it's really comes down to publishers. Does the publisher support that file size or not? And you can upload anything you want. It's going to give you a little warning at the when you're looking at the preview in Studio about the file size, but you can put that in a tag and traffic it, but it's really the publisher that has the final say on what kind of experience they want to impose on the viewers of their site.
And so to say that just one more time here, yes, the file size will count unless your publisher says no. And one of the ongoing discussions in this post-Chrome announcement, HTML5 world that we're having is, what CDNs or what should be excluded from the file size. Can we make recommendations on that? And there's talk about, common animation libraries and as well as fonts, because that is definitely a hot button issue. So currently it's coming down to the publishers, but soon, hopefully, we will have recommendations for what these publishers should be doing. So let's go back to the slides. Give it a sec. There we are. So let's talk about JavaScript, the logic. To me, this was a little bit confusing when I first started making ads, because I'm used to this jQuery world that has shorthand for everything. I just put in the logic for to call a DOM element, and then I manipulate it from there. And then I started learning about this enabler, and I was like, oh, this is not really how I originally thought it would work. And I think the reason why is because a couple of the things that I wasn't taking into account is file size, definitely for jQuery. It's definitely overkill for some of these smaller ads, because I think in our demo file here we probably have less than 100 lines of JavaScript, and that should really be done in JavaScript instead of loading in this entire jQuery library. As well as the other thing that I didn't take into account was, how are you going to track all this stuff? And thankfully, that's why we have DoubleClick Studio, and using the enabler's components and calling the enabler, we can add counters and timers and everything like that. So we can see a lot more analytics about our ad and how it's performing. So let's go back to the slides here, and as Owen was mentioning earlier, we have initialization and polite loading, and this is a good boilerplate. I'll quickly go line by line through this here. What this first group of lines here is saying is, okay, earlier in our HTML file we called the enabler JavaScript, and that's DoubleClick Studio's brains, like it's their components, it's their custom functionality. So what this first if-else statement is doing is, okay, is that enabler loaded in? If so, let's just move on. So that's great. That's just something you can copy and paste in there. And then we go into this section, which says, okay, is the initial load, or this is the page load handler. So if the initial load is complete, let's go on to the polite load content. So that's a really easy way of kind of just dividing things up immediately, and it's good because it allows you to, drop in fallbacks for your ad if you need to, and you can see what's going on line by line. Anything else you wanted to add there, Owen?
Yeah, it's basically you're setting up events, and on the complete of those events, then you're taking more actions. So this is just checking for, is the enabler initialized? Is it on the page? If it's not, we're adding an event, and then on the complete of that event, it's calling additional code. It's calling other functions.
Mhm.
And yeah, you just always want to wait until an enabler init to start taking action in your ad, because then you know the enabler is ready to call the proper reporting. Then you know you're ready to start loading on other assets.
Excellent. And then this is the next section about, okay, how do we store those DOM elements into a variable? And this was, when I read through this made a lot more sense to me, but coming from a jQuery world of just putting in the $sign and, calling the element name, this is, what we're doing is we're taking this longhand and just converting it to shorthand. It's not absolutely necessary by any means, but it's just a best practice on our ads to create some of these variables just so it's a little bit more readable.
Yeah, you're just grabbing the structure out of the page, out from the DOM, and putting it into your own data structure just so it's easy to retrieve for use in code. You're going to be adding handlers to these. You're going to be changing the display, changing the colors, whatever you're going to be doing. You have a nice, easy way that you've assembled and compiled, like grab these things and to put it in your own data structure, and now you can call it easily.
Yep. And so just to recap really quick, the DOM elements, like these are just our variable names. You can name them whatever you want to. And then on this side of the code is where we're actually calling the HTML IDs from the HTML files. So you can see the get element by ID, and that's where these names are coming from.
And that corresponds back to the HTML code, which is where we put an ID onto each element, and that's how you retrieve it.
And then for our ad specifically today, we're talking about a full screen ad. So similar to how we were checking for the enabler to see if it was initialized earlier, we also need to check for the full screen support. So here's just some boilerplate code to do that. And you can see that if it is supported, so that's in this section here, we're going to add some of our events here. So we're going to add an event listener that, when somebody clicks on the ad, it's going to do something. When they click on the collapse of the ad, it's going to do something. When they click on the CTA, it's going to do something. As well as this is the code that will start tracking that in Studio when it's uploaded to Studio later. So as you saw in the last one, we're calling that event the request collapse handler and the request expand handler. And here's where we're actually defining that according to the enabler. So controlling the expand state.
So we're walking through setting up the expansion lifecycle, and the expansion lifecycle has these different points in time when things occur, like request expand, finished expand, and then when you're going to collapse, it starts the collapse and then it finishes collapse. So we define these methods to run code at each of these different points in time, whether it's changing some CSS classes or removing an event handler so something's no longer clickable. Those are types of things that you'd want to do, or call a counter that, hey, this just got expanded. And so what we see here is that we're defining a method, expand start handler, and we're running a couple of statements, enabler, finish, request, expand. So some of it's required, like boilerplate for the expansion lifecycle, and some of it is up to you to do whatever you want to change the appearance and the functionality. So the first line there, you got to do that in the expand start handler. And then the next three where you're changing some of the styles, we're changing the we're adding a class called expand animation, which I think is a CSS transition. Then we're adding another, we're adjusting the style on the collapsed element, giving it a display at none, so that would be hiding it. And then on the expanded div, we're changing the style of that, we're setting it to block. So it's going to show it. If it was set to none initially, it would then appear. And then the second method, there's nothing in there. And then the last two statements are adding these events handlers to the enabler. When that event fires, then we're going to call these methods.
Cool. So then on controlling the collapse state, so again, what Owen was mentioning earlier, when the collapse state has started, we're going to remove that expand animation, and instead we're going to add the collapse animation. And then because we don't want things to happen at the exact same moment, in our CSS, which we'll go through later, there's a 300 millisecond animation. So we want to wait until that animation is complete before we actually change that to none. Otherwise, it'll just go away immediately.
So we're using a set timeout there. Sometimes, depending on what you're trying to do, you can use set interval. You can hook into the request animation frame that's built into the browser. And all of these are different ways that you can stagger or have complete control over what code you want to run and when.
And then best practice for any ad, actually, I believe a requirement for any ad is the good old click tag. You can call it an exit. You can call it your CTA, what have you. This is required, or else your ad will fail QA. So loading resources politely. We're still moving on here. I think the thing to call out in the polite loading is that when you're in JavaScript, you need to use that get URL. You can't just use a relative path like you do in the HTML. And the reason for that is when you actually upload your ad to DoubleClick Studio, it replaces those relative paths with absolute path that it will be on the CDN. So this is actually calling the DoubleClick CDN to look for that file. Again, I'll say this one more time. If you try and use relative paths in your JavaScript, it won't be able to find the asset when it's uploaded into your ad.
Yeah, this sample code's really good. It's wrapping your head around this is if you got this, then you have a pretty good handle of HTML. So that's the first line, in this page load handler method, that first line of code, var external JavaScript, that's using JavaScript to create an element from scratch. So we're creating, what type of element are we creating? We're creating a script. So that's how you load in JavaScripts onto the page. But just creating this element, it's not anywhere yet. It's just in virtual memory. It's not on the page. We're setting the type to text JavaScript. That's nice to give the browser a little extra info on what type of script we're going to be loading in. Then we're setting the attribute, the source attribute. That's telling the browser what the source is going to be, and then the enabler.getURL transforms this this local relative JavaScript file, transforms that into absolute, as Jake mentioned, and then at that point it's a script tag. It's ready to go. It's got its source, and it's all ready to come to the party. And then that next line of code writes it onto the page, calling the append child method on the head tag. So document.getElements by tag name. It gets the head tag. It's the first one. It's the only one on the page. So it's going to be at the 0th position on that array. And once that happens, then it's going to make that call to grab that URL, grab that remote asset and put it into the ad, and then at that point you can start calling the methods on it. And then the external CSS, it's the same exact thing, only you're not creating a JavaScript tag or a script tag, you're creating a link tag and setting the href attribute to a remote file. But it's the same premise, just for a different type of tag. And you could do the same thing with an image tag, where you create it in memory, document create element image img, and set that source attributes. It's the same. Once you get get the concept and the intuition behind what are elements, how does the DOM deal with them, how do I put them on the page or remove them from the page, that's just really solid kind of fundamental understanding of HTML.
Excellent. I want to talk about that one. So for our polite JavaScript file, the main thing that we're going to be pulling in is getting the URL for this greenlines.svg, and that will be our background attribute. It will just be a little graphic on the background on the expand from there.
So if you're building standard banners and you're wondering when to start your animation, the onload method is a pretty good bet. On the body tag, you can wait for the onload event, and that will get you. You can be sure that the DOM is assembled and everything's ready to go. That it's parsed the whole page, and then you can begin your animation.
And would you recommend that over the DCM content loaded versus the ready state?
Yep.
Excellent. That was one of the questions that we had in the QA I saw crop up there. So using a web font loader JS, and again, you'll have access to the slides after this presentation, but there's a public GitHub for that. And what we're going to be doing in here is we got to tell, all right, what families do we need to load, what font families? So we're going to be using the Roboto font, which is Google's probably most popular font. That's a lot of the boilerplate code that you see on the external Google websites is using that Roboto font. And then we're going to subset, so we're going to say which characters to pull in here. And we're going to go into subsetting in just a second in terms of how that affects the page load size if you subset versus pulling in the entire font face. But again, here we have some web font code of starting to load the font and then showing the text and then coming up with a plan B. What happens if somehow your font fails in the process. So without subsetting the characters, if you're pulling in the entire font, and when I say the entire font, I mean, okay, you're pulling in asterisks, ampersands, percentage signs, everything under the moon in the Latin character set. It's going to be 67 kilobytes. But in our ad, we were just pulling in the alphabet and an exclamation point because that's maybe what your ad called for. The difference in that is 4.6 kilobytes. Now this is really
That's a huge savings in file size.
Excellent, Owen. I'm glad you pointed that out. But with great power comes great responsibility. So when you start pulling this in, you'll notice that this is a unique URL. You have your add text attribute, you're going A through Z, and then you're adding the exclamation point. That's great if you're just trying to squeeze a few more kilobytes out of your ad and if you're just trying to meet a publisher's spec. However, this won't be cached in your browser. And you might be asking, okay, why does that matter? Well, it's for the good of all ads. So if somebody was using the Roboto font and on a different ad, and it was the Latin subset, so the entire Latin character set, and then they went to your ad and it was using the same thing, that wouldn't count on the user's load of the page. So it would count if the publishers are looking at it, but in terms of you're in the wide open internet, it's going to load a little bit quicker because you won't even have that 4.6 kilobyte hit on your ad.
Yeah, your browser remembers as the browser. So getting back to the whole what a browser does to load a web page, it goes line by line on each line of the HTML text file. And then if it encounters a remote resource, it first, before going to get that resource, it checks to see, do I know about this file? Have I ever seen this before? If it does, and it's cached. If it goes and gets something, it brings it back, and now it's in cache. So sometimes it doesn't need to go all the way out to the internet to get some of the resources to display on the screen. And that's what Jake is talking about here, where you have a font file, and you want to show it in an ad, and it might be a common font file like Roboto. So then there's a pretty good chance that the user might already have that stored on their machine if they have caching on, which most consumers don't turn off caching. They're not, ad practitioners. So they have all of these files sitting in cache, and then you can just hook into that performance. So the browser doesn't have to go out to the internet to get things. Every time the browser has to go out to the internet, it starts adding up, and that results on the user experience is like they have to wait to see these things. Sometimes an ad will show up, and then the fonts will snap to the right ad when the font finally loads into memory, and they get around to doing all this. And right, so you just need to be aware when you start changing the URL that the URL request is going to get, that if it's different, then you're not getting the benefit of the user. You're adding a hit to the user's page load.
And that concept that Owen was just referring to about things being cached in the browser is why when we talk about third-party libraries and we talk about, what do publishers allow, from the publisher's standpoint, if I was the publisher, I'd be more inclined to say, okay, it's okay if you have some of these third-party libraries as long as they're coming from this specific CDN. So because we have a greater percent of confidence that they'll already be cached on somebody's browser. So if we were just using jQuery as an example, much of the internet still uses jQuery, and it's probably cached on somebody's browser. So if I was a publisher, I'd say, all right, as long as it's coming from this specific CDN, this CDN that's hosting the jQuery library, and it's hosting this version, then I don't believe it should count in the file size.
In AdWords, if you use the Google-hosted jQuery API, it does not count towards the file size of the ad unit. Following on that same point is we're working with GreenSocks to have a Google-hosted version of GreenSocks so that you can get the benefit of caching. Like if everybody's using that same URL, then the users are going to have that machine on their machine already. So that's just ways we're working with industry partners to try to give the user the best experience possible so that they have like this beautiful experience.
And that's actually a great segue into CSS animations. Well, animations in general, which is our next topic. So we're going to go through all the ways to animate in an ad. Now, having said that, I'm going to recommend specifically 2 ways. But I just want you guys to make sure you're aware of all the different options because each option has its own benefits, and depending on your ad, you might need to use canvas animation. That's personally not my favorite. So all these demos, again, they're going to be in the deck that we give to you afterwards, but we're hosting some CodePen examples here, and we're going to move a box from left to right. So one way to do that is with JavaScript and CSS. So if we were just trying to pull in all the different JavaScript logic, okay, we're going to take this on the x-axis, we're going to move it from here to here, and then we're going to set it to animate everything. That's one way of doing it. See if I have my rerun. Not popping up there. I can pull that up over here on this external site real quick, and you can see it run. So that runs automatically as well. I would not recommend this version, but just so you know, it's there. You can animate with pure JavaScript. You can get in there, and you can start throwing in some lines of code.
We're going to ask for a survey at the end. If you fill out the survey, then you'll get access to this deck in PDF format. So just stay tuned for that and be sure to answer the survey so you can play with some of this code.
Canvas animation is another way of going about it. Again, it's going to render the same results. In my mind, it's a little more complex on the JavaScript side, and again, it involves a lot of hand coding. So I personally would stay away from it. But having said that, depending on what your ad calls for, maybe the canvas element is right for you. But then we're going to start getting into some of my favorites. I'm personally a fan of CSS3 transitions. I think that was a huge jump in the internet to, bringing some cool interactivity into web pages that are pretty light. And what that involves, if you've ever seen CSS transition code before, you can see this go through. We're going to do this with JavaScript real quick, where you're adding the class onto it. So if you add the class of animate to this box, it's going to transform the X, and it's going to go right on over. Again, not my preferred method, though, because this next CSS method of CSS animations is my personal preferred method. And this may look like a little bit of code here because you're actually setting up some keyframes to say, okay, at 0%, I want it to start on one side. At 100% of this animation, I want it to go to the other side. And you could say, okay, this is linear timing rather than ease in, ease out. It's going to take a second to move along. You're just setting a variable here for the keyframes and goes. That's my preferred method for simple animations like this, and especially in the ad that we're demoing today, we're just moving things just kind of up and around, just very simple transforms. Now, one thing that we're leaving out here is some of the vendor prefixes, and I believe we should be getting into those in just a moment. But first, let's talk about third-party libraries. Third-party libraries are becoming a hot new trend. I see a lot of questions about GreenSock. Me personally, I would recommend GreenSock for your complex animations if you're hand coding, and that's mostly because the GreenSock JavaScript is really easy to read. It's easy to manipulate with CSS animations. You might start coding 50 lines of CSS and then decide that line 40 is not quite right, and you have to go back and change lines 40 through 50. But with GreenSock, it's a lot easier to do that, and you can see on their quick demo here that it pulls in just like the rest.
Right, and the history of GreenSock is it was one of the most popular Flash animation libraries. Everybody used to use it when I would build full Flash sites. We would make extensive use of GreenSock, and the syntax and the functions, the method names, everything is the same. So it's very nice when you're coming from this Flash background that you have this familiar, code library that you're used to, and it's just you feel at home again. You just go, oh yeah, TweenLight, yeah, TweenLight 2, and then it's very intuitive, the usage and the syntax.
And the thing to note about GreenSock is it's still part of your file size at the moment. There's discussions about, okay, can that be uploaded onto a CDN? Can we get publishers to say that this is common enough that it doesn't need to be included? So usually what it comes down to is CSS transformations and animations versus third-party libraries like GreenSock. I personally wouldn't recommend doing JavaScript, like straight out coding your JavaScript animation, just because it's a lot of lines of code. It can get confusing pretty quickly, as well as I personally don't use canvas animation too much, but it might be right for your situation.
Yeah, the canvas tag is one of those new elements that was introduced in HTML5. The canvas tag, the video tag, the audio tag, that was the sprinkling peppering onto the language of HTML4 that already existed, and a lot of people bundle together like these concepts of CSS3 transitions, and it just bundles HTML5 and all that. But we hope that with this presentation we kind of demystify some of those things.
So we're going to go back to the slides to talk about our final section here, which is CSS. Just so you know, I realize that we're down to the last 12 minutes here, so we'll try and get through these last 8 slides in less than 5 minutes, and we'll take some of your popular questions on the Hangout. So CSS, I think the the thing to specifically call out here is this box sizing border box. This was a recommendation by a fellow Googler, Paul Irish, that if you're doing responsive website coding, like this is the tag to end all tags. Like this is essential. And what that does is it fixes kind of like what the actual width of an element should be, and it makes responsive coding a lot easier. Going from there, we have a couple of our boilerplate things. Normally when you're coding like a larger website, you're going to have a reset.css, and what that will do is make sure all the browsers are acting with elements the same way, so it kind of like levels the playing field between browsers. That's not becoming as much of an issue as these browsers start to grow up, specifically like Firefox, Chrome, and Internet Explorer. They're getting to be a lot more consistent. But one thing that I'd always recommend is just removing that margin and padding from the HTML and body elements. This is our font code. We're going for Roboto. A good font stack says, all right, if Robato's not there, what are we going for? Here we're just dropping in a sans serif, but we can also chain these together and add like Arial as a specific fallback before going to a sans serif. And there's a lot of good font stack sites out there. So if loading a custom font is not quite right for you, but you want to run the risk of, okay, we have this custom font that might be on 50% of users' computers. We don't want to bother uploading our own version of that, but we do want to have some fallbacks. You can definitely find those online. And so we're adding some collapse state code in here. I think the thing to specifically call out is this media query. So media queries take a look at the browser. They can look at the browser size. They can do a lot of cool stuff, but specifically what we're looking at here is the pixel density. And if you're on a Retina display device, which a lot of tablets and phones definitely are on, as well as more and more desktop computers are becoming more densely, having more of a dense display.
What that means is for every pixel that would be on a normal screen, there's 4 or 9. There's going to be more pixels on the display than another device. And so what that means is the edges, when you look at an image that has a curve on it, you'll start to see it'll start to look fuzzy on a Retina display if you don't do what the CSS is, which is show a different image, a bigger image, one that's twice as big, that has twice as many pixels, that preserves that razor-sharp edge. Type, images, logos, anything where you want it to be crisp, and especially when you're putting an image next to type, the type is going to get rendered in that very high resolution, and then if you put a logo next to it, it's going to look fuzzy. And this media query allows you to target the devices specifically and manage that so that the user gets the perfect display, and it's not heavier than it needs to be, and it's not lighter and fuzzy,
And if we could go back to the slides for 1 second, I think a very important concept to point out if you're still pretty new to media queries and Retina displays, this image that we're going to be pulling in if somebody has a Retina display is actually 640 pixels by 100 pixels, so it's twice the size. And that's not twice the DPI, so if you're used to a print background and you're like, all right, 72 DPI is the web, maybe I should just double that to 144. What we're actually doing here instead is, doubling the size of the image, not the DPI. And then with CSS, we're saying this background size element is going to resize that. And Retina displays and phones will take care of it from there and display like the higher resolution version.
So if you're not familiar with media queries, there's all different kinds of rules, and there's an array. This is for seeing what the device is for their display, but then there's the width, there's the height, there's the device width, device height, there's a whole slew of rules and different combination sets that you can apply logic, like if it's this and this, then apply these styles. If it's between this, until this, then apply these styles. And then in that way, you can kind of manage each of the, like across all of this array of screens, TVs, you can dial in and dictate exactly how you want it to look on anything you want.
So quickly going through the last couple slides here, we have the code in here for our animation expand, and as you can see, we're using the CSS animations here, just because it's a very simple animation again. From there, we have the code in for the animation of the expand, and these are all in the demo files. I'm just going pretty quickly here because I know you guys have a couple burning questions on the Q&A that I want to go through. But one important thing to point out is CSS vendor prefixes. So when the CSS3 spec was still pretty new, browsers handled these new, these new styles very differently. And so you had to put in prefixes. So the WebKit would target the Chrome and Safari WebKit browsers, and MOZ would target the Firefox browsers, or would target Opera. This is not becoming as much of an issue as these browsers, again, begin to mature. But there is a way to automatically add in those vendor prefixes with a lot of post-CSS auto prefixers. There's a lot of different libraries that can help you do that. If you're curious what still needs a prefix, caniuse.com is a site that we use over and over again to see the browser compatibility of all these things. So in the deck that you guys will get right after this presentation, we'll have our lag tag and our working files. But just to show you again, now that we've gone through all this stuff, take a second to breathe it in. You'll see the animation for the expand, the click tag fades in, the SVG is loaded here. We have our animation before calling the collapse state, and everything is working accordingly. So let's go to a couple questions here, Owen. And we're just going to throw up this this feedback form right there, just in case we run out of time.
Okay, so that was great walking through the hand-coded. Now, one of the questions is, what are the advantages of hand-coding to using an IDE like Google Web Designer? Well, I prefer Google Web Designer because it gives me a visual way to build beautiful creatives. It's got drag-and-drop components. It's got a timeline that you may be used to if you're a motion graphics practitioner. And it's all very visual, but I still have all the flexibility to go into the code if I'd like to. I can edit it outside in my favorite code editor and then open it back up in Google Web Designer.
As well as Google Web Designer is free, not to give you guys the hard sales pitch here, but it's a free tool to assist in building ads, and it definitely bridged the gap for me as I was moving into a lot of the rich media ads. Hand coding HTML5, some people are just used to building things all by hand. Some people change their own oil on their car. So HTML5 hand coding definitely has its place, and you can get it as custom as you want to. You can control every single aspect of it.
And we have a number of templates. We launched a couple weeks ago the starter files kit, which you can find on the Rich Media Gallery. That's a way that you can start from a template of pre-configure whatever format and size that you're going to build, whether it's a lightbox or an expanding in-app or an in-page. Any format you want, you just fill out a couple of form items, and then you can either click to open it in Google Web Designer or just download the vanilla files and then open up and start from there. That's what I would always recommend. We walk through what's going on with the expansion lifecycle, how you wait for enabler and it to start loading assets, but really you shouldn't need to do that if you're an agency trying to make 50 different sizes of ads to be served on the across from dynamic bidding. You want to optimize it wherever you can, and starting from a template does that. It saves that time.
Yeah. So going through a couple of the other questions, we talked about the Google font request counting towards the file size currently, but Again, it comes down to publishers. Hopefully soon publishers will agree that the Google Font CDN shouldn't be counted towards the library, but in the meantime, we're at the mercy of the publishers.
Right, so stay plugged into the developments with the IAB. As soon as you have a new job coming up that has a media plan, take a look at the publishers on there, visit their publishers' specs pages, and try to kind of be mindful of the limits and build to the lowest common denominator.
We talked about GreenSock. I see a couple questions in here about preferred tween libraries. I think GreenSock is a good option. It's one of the most popular options. I think a lot of people don't have that steep of a learning curve when switching from Flash to GreenSock.
Do we recommend CSS over JavaScript animations? I would try to do CSS where you can, because that's a little faster. It works in the browser directly rather than having to run JavaScript to perform the action. Sometimes if you have a ton of JavaScript on the page, if the publisher site that the ad is on has a bunch, it's like hogging the main memory of the JavaScript engine, then you want to, not have your ads experience dependent on this, like all those cycles.
And again, that comes down to just how complex your CSS is versus the JavaScript. Each has their place in the ad. You can benchmark both of them. Sometimes a third-party library will perform better. Sometimes CSS will perform better. CSS is built into the browser. You have to call third-party libraries for some of the JavaScript stuff. It kind of just depends on the scenario of the ad.
Okay. Do we plan on making extensions for Flash Canvas? That's going to be a no. And thank you so much for hanging out with us today. This has been great. I think we all really learned a lot. Jake, I think you were great.
I think I learned a lot.
I think we all learned a little something here today about ourselves, about
and
each other, about HTML5.
And for the rest of your questions on there, we'll be reviewing them and uploading them as well, so they will get answered.
And don't forget to fill out the survey. We have a QR code that'll take you right there. We have a Google short link for those who are watching after. And thank you so much, and keep making beautiful ads.
Definitely let us know your thoughts on all this stuff, because we're trying to tailor this content for you guys. So let us know what you think. I'll just keep smiling.
We like hold the cup of coffee and it just